Hi everyone. We are going to be talking about Ernst Stadler's The Saying. It's a poem that you read at the earlier portion of the course. We're going to reintroduce it to learn how to apply the 5 steps to practicing critical reading to poetry, and also compare 2 different translations of that same poem to one another. Ernst Stadler was a German expressionist in the early 1900s. And the poem has been translated multiple times, not just by these 2 writers, but also others. And when you translate as a writer or a poet, you make choices about the best way to represent the material and the message. And as we are going to see, there are different interpretations on how it should be translated. And that's going to help us understand how poets generate meaning and make choices about the technique and style they use to do so. So I'm going to pull up the 2 documents for us to look at today. One of them is the document with the poem, which you're going to read. And then I'll pull up the Practicing Critical Reading 5 Steps, which we looked at last video, and do a side-by-side walkthrough with you, answering the questions of the 5 steps to this poem. And then I'm going to send you out to do a discussion on your own, responding to the 2 translations. So let me pull up our 2 documents. Okay. And I'll make this one a little bigger. And there's going to be some crossover here, but we'll do our best to go from poem to poem, or from sheet to sheet, to apply these steps to the poem. So, now that we're set up, follow along as I read. Just listen to me read. Take in the poem, take in the story, the speaker, even start thinking if it's in present or past tense. Start noticing where some of the style skills and poetic techniques are, and then we'll dig in to explore those intuitions in a second. So here's this document, and it has these 2 translations, and just by the look of them you can see they're radically different. We're not going to get into those differences just yet, but we're just going to stick with this first translation of the poem to do our 5 steps to practicing critical reading. So this is translated by the poet Stephen Berg, and it is the poem called The Saying by Ernst Stadler. In an old book, I stumbled across a saying. It was like a stranger punching me in the face. It won't stop gnawing at me. When I walk around at night looking for a beautiful girl, when a lie or a description of life or somebody's fake way of being with people occurs instead of reality, when I betray myself with an easy explanation as if what's dark is clear, as if life doesn't have thousands of locked burning gates, when I use words without really having known their strict openness, and put my hands around things that don't excite me, when a dream hides my face with soft hands and the day avoids me, cut off from the world, cut off from who I am deeply, I freeze where I am and see hanging in the air in front of me, stop being a ghost. So, of course, you'll remember this poem from the packet, and maybe you understand some of the basics already. I think that'll just help us as we go through the 5 steps of critical reading, because you already have a foundation here. So let's work through it and see how to get an understanding not just of the meaning or message of this poem, but how the writer makes us believe that meaning, makes us understand it, makes us feel it. So one thing I'll say before we get there, something I've said before, is that poems oftentimes don't directly state their meaning or their message. Oftentimes they're implied through all these poetic techniques like imagery and metaphor, diction, syntax, to help the reader feel a particular way, and if they investigate those feelings, they'll understand what the poem's value was. This poem, like some of the poems in our poetry packet, pretty much outright says what its meaning is. It tells us, almost in this imperative sense, to stop being a ghost. Now, of course, we have to interpret ghost, so there is some room for interpretation, and the message isn't directly stated. But for the most part, it tells us what its message is, it tells us what it's about. So a lot of what we're going to be doing as we look at this poem is just figure out how it makes us believe it, how it makes us feel it, how it makes us remember that argument, and in order to show that it's an effective expression of this idea. So, I'm going to the worksheet. The basics. Read the poem out loud. We did it. Mark words you do not understand and look them up. You know, this is going to be individual to everyone, but a quick look at the poem might tell me that I need to look up gnawing. Gnawing can be taken two ways. It could be used as a synonym for bothering. It won't stop bothering me. It won't stop burdening me. But gnawing also means chew. And chew automatically makes us think of a physical action. So it's almost, in a way, metaphorical. Well, in this case, it is personified. An old saying is, like a stranger punching me in the face, it won't stop gnawing at me. So there's this very physical nature to it. Gnawing you might have needed to look up, and you'd want to know that personification is there. I don't know, some words like betray. You might want to look up what kind of alternative meanings this word has. Anything else that sticks out to me could be those are the only two that stick out to me. But this is individual to everyone. Maybe there's some vocabulary in here you don't know and you need to look it up. Do so. Maybe there's some words that you feel are emphasized in here and you want to look up their alternative meanings. Do so. So we're going to move on, but that's just highlighting the process. Next is the story. Who is speaking? And what do we know about the speaker? So who is speaking? Sometimes we have to answer that by saying, what do we know about the speaker? What does he show us about himself or herself? What we know is that he acts in a certain way. So this is this person who has explained a number of different scenarios that he's been in his life. And all of them are started with these when statements. We see them throughout the poem. So what we know about this speaker is that occasionally he walks around at night looking for a beautiful girl. Occasionally he lies or projects an image of himself that is false. Occasionally he gives easy explanations to complicated ideas. He uses words without really considering their meaning. He does things that he's not passionate about. He chooses to do things he's not passionate about. He idealizes the world and or daydreams about the world instead of facing its reality. And so we know who he is by what he does. And that's the best we can say so far. Some of these questions might overlap. So who is speaking and what do we know about the speaker? Well, what we know about the speaker is how he acts. And so when it says what action, if any, is taking place, we have to consider that and also consider the action that's happening in the past or the present tense. So I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but we see we're in the story still. So let's look at the tense first, and then we can look at the action. So at the beginning, he gives us a past tense expression. In an old book, I stumbled across a saying. So it's past tense. So when we ask the question, is there any action? Well, there's action that happened. He found this book, and there was a particular saying in it that struck him. It was like a stranger punching me in the face. Again, past tense. When he first read it, when he first opened the book and saw this saying, it had a great impact on him. He felt like it was physically hitting him. So there was this power to it. So that's part of the action, and that's part of the past tense. And then immediately he moves us into the present tense. It won't stop gnawing at me. So it currently is gnawing at him. So this expression that was once in the past very powerful continues to be powerful. He continues to think about it, to be weighed down by it, to consider it. And so we have the present tense here. It won't stop gnawing at me. And then he gives us a series of conditional present tense situations. This I walk around at night doesn't mean that he's doing that in the moment of the poem. So it's not action that's currently taking place. He's telling us that in times where he does walk around, so when he does walk around, and this is, again, it's not something that he's currently doing. The only action that's currently happening in the poem is that the thing won't stop gnawing at him. The following are just examples of some situations he might encounter where that gnawing is particularly strong. And so we have that the rest of the poem. When. It's all these conditions, situational circumstances. And then he says, when those things happen, I freeze where I am and see hanging in the air in front of me, stop being a ghost. So this is present tense. I freeze. When that happens, I freeze. So we have some past tense, some present tense, some conditional present tense, and present tense again. So again, just kind of playing around with that and seeing how the tenses work and how the action of the poem finds its way into either past or present tense is important, because that's going to help us start breaking down the poem and noticing other things. Because as we even started to notice what's happening in these present tense conditionals, it starts telling us a little bit something about the style and the poetic technique. So the more closely we look at one element, the more we're likely to see another. So we can go and do what is the main idea, image, thought, or feeling of each stanza. We won't go stanza by stanza, but to get the idea, we'll just look at the first couple. In an old book I stumbled across a saying, it was like a stranger punching me in the face. So there's some language here, stumbled and punching. That tells us he feels maybe disoriented, he feels confused, he feels kind of overwhelmed potentially by this saying that he came across. And that's just a quick look at how we can talk about the emotional effect or idea of each stanza. And he says, it won't stop gnawing at me. That's no longer just being overwhelmed or overpowered. That's being, what is that being? That's being almost obsessive and or overly thinking or feeling this thing. It's kind of burdening him. So burden is a different feeling here. You can continue to do that throughout these different explanations. I'm going to let you do that on your own, just giving you an example. So let's move into the style. What is the tone of the poem? How can you tell? Can you identify any markers of style, such we practiced in the style portfolio? So tone might intersect with what we said about what the main idea or emotion of the poem is. So we looked at this language, stumbled and punching. So there's this idea of confusion or bewilderment or being overpowered. That is the tone of this stanza. And it is given to us through the diction choices. To understand the overall tone of the poem, we have to keep reading, and look a little bit more closely at this when structure and the final independent clause that comes at the end. Specifically look at the tone of the final line and see how it affects the whole poem. So in order to do that, in order to answer question 1, we really have to look at these markers of style. And we really have to look at the rhetorical choices, because those will all help us say this is how we can tell what the tone of the poem is. It's not just the language choice, but it's also what is being said and how it's being said as a whole. So, style. I notice metaphor. Right? It was like a stranger punching me in the face. Personification, which is another form of imagery, won't stop gnawing at me. We see a very interesting syntactical construction. These are dependent clauses. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different dependent clauses. Some of them have a positives built into them as well. 5 dependent clauses that all depend on the final independent clause of the poem. I freeze where I am. So that's another skill we practiced early on. It's another style choice that the writer made. Part of that is just recognizing that this is all one sentence. And so that's a stylistic choice that the writer made. And it's also a rhetorical choice, and we're going to talk about the effect of this in just a second, which will help even say something about the tone of the poem. Anything else? Life doesn't have thousands of locked, burning gates. It's another metaphor that we have. When a dream hides my face with soft hands is another personification. Ghost is a metaphor here. It's representing an abstract idea. It's a physical thing to represent the abstract idea. So a lot of metaphor and imagery, and then these syntactical and lineation moves that we're seeing. And that kind of helps us say a lot about rhetorical choice, markers of style, poetic technique. Poetic technique, we talked about diction for tone, we talked about imagery, we talked about syntax. There might be some sound that we can find in here, like, oh, look at the repetition of that sound. I don't think it is the focal point of this poem, but it is there if we looked for it. I'll let you do that on your own. More than anything else, we want to talk about what the emotional or logical effects of these style choices are, because that's going to help us say what the poet's trying to get us to believe, understand, or feel. So all these kind of work together. Even though they're steps, they kind of intermingle, and you have to be able to jump around a little bit. Well, in order to find out what the tone of the poem is, I need to look at these things. In order to know what the poem's trying to get me to understand, I need to look at these things. And so they kind of work as more like angles of looking at the poem instead of steps. Ultimately, let's wrap up our analysis of this poem by going to the end. The end of this poem tells us to stop being a ghost. Now, of course, there's an interesting rhetorical move happening here, because what the sentence is telling us is that he sees a sign hanging in front of him. So he's saying, when I do this, when I do this, when I do this, I see this sign. And then the final line is almost like he's reading the sign that's in front of him, and he's reading it out loud. Like the sign is telling him to stop being a ghost. But the very fact that this is put on its own line, it is all capitalized, and it is an imperative, which is one of our style skills that we notice happening here. We as readers can't help but reading this final line as a command to us. Stop being a ghost. It's almost like it's being screamed at us. And so we're going to work from this place and say, well, part of the purpose of this poem is to communicate to the reader to stop being a ghost. What does that mean? We have to do some interpretation by looking at the metaphor and looking at the scenarios that he played out before. But ultimately, this is his goal. So if we started with ghost, we can just simply say, well, ghosts are not real. They're not part of reality. They're detached from reality and the circumstances of the world. They have different rules, I guess you could say, than humans who live in this world have. And so We can translate stop being a ghost as stop living in a dream world. We can translate it as stop being fake. We can translate it as stop lying to yourself. Stop betraying yourself. Because this is language that we see throughout the poem. And so now if we know that the point of this poem is to get us as the readers to stop lying to ourselves, to stop faking it with other people, to stop betraying how we really feel and what we're really passionate about, or maybe things that we think people want to see us as and an image we want to portray. We know that the purpose of the poem is to make us feel that and believe that. How does Stadler and Stephen Berg's translation make us feel that way? Well, that's how we analyze a poem. We want to look for support and look for evidence in the poem to suggest that we actually will come to believe this and value this ourselves at the end. So one of the ways he does it is first he establishes the importance of this saying, but he does it at the same time with an element of suspense. He doesn't tell us what the old saying was. They stumbled across this saying and it was so powerful. So we as readers from the very beginning are already feeling like we want to know something, that he's keeping something from us. So there's this element of, what is this thing? We're intrigued. We want to know what it is. What is this thing that's so powerful? So we keep reading. But at the same time, he has set up in us this kind of incomplete thought, that we're sitting here reading and wanting to know what the saying was. And so there's a little bit of tension that comes with that, a little bit of uncertainty. And so we feel that as readers from the very beginning, because he doesn't tell us what the saying is. Then we can look at this big long sentence. And this idea that dependent clauses withhold the main idea of a sentence from us as readers. Not only in their singular use, but when they're used 5 times in a row, we are particularly withheld from the main idea. As readers of English, we always are looking for the main subject and the main verb and the main object of a sentence. And when it's withheld from us, not only do we have to keep reading to find it, but the more it's delayed, and the more it stalls, the more tense or uncertain or excited or confused potentially that we get. So Berg is using this feeling of instability that he gives us in the very beginning and using its syntax construction to keep us in that place of tension and confusion and uncertainty. The syntax and the line breaks mimic or imitate how the speaker himself feels. When he's doing this stuff, he feels uncertain, he feels detached, he feels like he's not living who he fully is. And the writer makes us feel that way with his syntax, with these 5 dependent clauses that keep us at bay, keep us guessing, keep us wondering, keep us uncertain. That is part of the reason that when we get to stop being a ghost, it resonates more deeply with us. Because we have felt what it's like to be a ghost. We've felt that instability. We've felt that uncertainty, that tension of not being fully ourselves, so that when he says it, we're more likely to believe it. It's almost like problem solution. He makes us feel that there's a problem before he gives us the solution, before he gives us the response or the argument. We know that from the In Defense of essay in Barbara Holland. Last thing I'll say about this is poems don't intend to be confusing, meaning they don't intend to be logically confusing so that we don't know what's going on. So when I say that this section creates a little bit of tension, uncertainty, or confusion, it's emotional uncertainty and emotional confusion, not logical. Because if we break down these dependent clauses and read them one by one, we can definitely understand what it's saying. And Stephen Berg actually helps us kind of digest this uncertainty as well by breaking the dependent clauses into stanzas. It gives us time to kind of collect ourselves, consider what this dependent clause meant, consider what this dependent clause meant, consider what this one meant. And so he's not leaving us in a state of logical confusion. He's just making us feel that uncertainty that the speaker himself feels. And it's so that this final statement can be that much more impactful. So that more or less covers these 5 steps. The basics, the story, the style, the poetic technique, and then the purpose. Trying to make an understanding of what the writer intended to do and how he was successful in doing it by using what he's saying and how he's saying it to do so. So the last thing I want to say is that we do have 2 translations here. We have the Stephen Berg one, and this isn't my as in my, it's a translation I found online, and I just copied and pasted this kind of preface. We have this other translation, and immediately it looks very different. It's 1 stanza instead of, 7? It's longer lines instead of the shorter lines, and there's a couple other differences as well. What I want you to do as a way to emphasize that, pardon me, that poets make meaning not just with what they say, but with how they say it. So I want you to read this second poem in its second translation on your own and identify what makes it different. So what's the different how? How does it go about communicating? And evaluate which one you think is more effective in making you as a reader believe the final line. So if the goal is to get you as a reader to live in reality, be what you really are, stop being fake, stop being a liar, and stop betraying the reality of who you are. The goal of the poem is to make you feel that, believe that, live in that. Which poem is more effective at doing so, and why? So in order to do so, you have to look at specific evidence of these poems to say why you're more emotionally connected or logically connected to the argument. I give you a head start with these prefaces, and what I've underlined is that each preface hints at what's different, at least in part, from the other one. The Stephen Berg translation has new metaphors not contained in the original poem, and we already pointed out some of those metaphors. There's not as many metaphors in the second one. So it seems like Berg is relying more on imagery than other characteristics of the poem. So that's part of his how. He gives us the images and the emotional responses we have to them to convince us of his argument. The second one focuses more on different lineation. We could say each of these have different lineation, of course. The lines are longer, there's only 1 stanza, and here the lines are shorter and there's multiple stanzas. So what is the different effect of that on you? Emotional effect, logical effect. The writer points out also that the original in German had rhyming couplets and rhythm that made up the poem's charm. Now, neither of these poems have rhyming couplets or a particular metrical rhythm. So already we're seeing that there are at least 3 different ways in which this poem has been generated, has generated its content, has tried to get the reader to believe in that final message. And so I'm going to send you off to do a discussion. You can read the prompt in the next module and do the discussion post. Be as specific as you can to explain which of these 2 makes you believe the idea more fully and why. And that'll be it for today. And good luck. I can't wait to read your responses.